Hi everyone, thanks for coming today. I want to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians across Queensland, particularly the Yuggera people on whose land we meet today, and I want to acknowledge their elders past and present. I want to also pay my respect to all those peoples on whose lands I live, work, research and write, which is basically the entirety of Australia. And this includes in Melbourne, the country of the Wurrung and Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. And I also want to extend this respect to any Indigenous people here with us today. So just to spatially locate us, many of you might be familiar with this site today. It centres on Brisbane's Queen Street, mainly at the intersection with Edward Street. So during the 1870s and 1880s, the street grew to become the business centre of the city, including its shopping heart. In 1877, the first European-style arcade was opened a few doors away, near to the GPO. And the research you'll hear about stems originally from my PhD thesis, which examined Australian arcades of the 19th century, including Brisbane's. It looked at their architectural, social and economic history, including the shops, products, entertainments and people found within. So while arcades are often viewed as feminine spaces for women to gather and shop, retail establishments and other businesses aimed at this sort of clientele were an important part of the offerings of these leisure spaces. And they included familiar shops like milliners, dress, hat and glove makers, shoe and boot shops, women's hairdressers and tea rooms, as well as other offerings like sewing machine and paper pattern retailers. While women are usually imagined as customers, arcade owners and tenants are more often thought of as men. But my research and that of others has shown that women were regularly the driving forces between commercial endeavours, both large and small, in Australia and globally. And this includes the arcades, even if their involvement is hidden. At times, it's fully acknowledged, but not uncommonly, their husbands or other men are credited as the brains behind the business. It's one of these women that led me to the research that I'm going to talk about today, a woman who was the wife of the supposed brains behind both of Brisbane's 19th century arcades. And one of the things I came to realise during my doctoral research was that this woman was likely heavily involved in his business venture. My interest in that woman, Sophia Morwitch, led me to propose this project for the Visiting Fellowship at Griffith University's Harry Gentle Resource Centre, which gave me the capacity to undertake more in-depth exploration of women entrepreneurs in Brisbane's 19th century arcades than I was able to do during my thesis. I want to thank the team at the centre, including Mark, Lee and Yorick, for their collegial support over the past year. And my thanks to everyone at Queensland State Archives, including Jenny Kidd, Alicia Ray and Bernadette Mulder, who are hosting us today. It's here that I found a wonderful array of primary sources that form some of the backbone of the research. And if you come on the tour, you'll be able to see some of that. Some of it's online, or you can come and look at that in person too on other days. But I also want to thank a gentleman called Scott Morwitch, who's several times grandnephew of Sophia, who's always been generous with his own research and discoveries. And I guess shows me that family historians, if you're doing any kind of research about people, are a wealth of information and generosity in communicating with scholars. So first I'll tell you a little bit about the project's aim and some of the results that had come from it before I share the lives of 3 women who worked in this building. In proposing the project, I wanted to reject notions of women as simply customers or mere employees and examine their roles as entrepreneurs in their own right. The study was intended to follow the lives of some of these women and their businesses, asking questions about their origins and mobility, the businesses they operated, their funding sources and advertising, commodities and services they provided, and the practicalities of being a woman in business in 19th century Brisbane. And I proposed several outputs from the project, which you can see some of those there. And that was an online database exhibition and map that would tracing the movements of the women and the commodities they sold. And this would include digitised archival material as well. I was going to give several public talks and one academic conference presentation. And this will also make an important contribution, probably maybe part of a chapter towards the monograph I'm going to write on my thesis research. So over the past year, I have gathered documents and information from global archives, not just Australia, for about a dozen women who own businesses in the Brisbane arcades. And I traced the lives in detail of 6 of them, including 3 who feature today. Their stories are going to appear on the website, and they'll also contribute to the new Harry Gentle Resource Centre Dictionary of Biography, which we've heard about. I've also done work plotting coordinates for some of the women business owners, the goods they supplied, and their international journeys and networks. This is going to eventually be displayed in an interactive map, and that will probably be on Google Maps or another online mapping platform, and that will connect with the website. So hopefully in a few months I'll be able to release that to the world as well. I have given a lot of talks arising from this project to conferences and seminars, and in July I'm taking it to Sweden to present at the World Economic History Congress, which in a panel about women in business. So we're going to get a lot of international kind of interaction and bring this story of these Brisbane women to the world. Much of what I'll talk about today is also part of an article that has come out of the research, which has been accepted for review in the Australian Economic History Review. So hopefully that will come out later this year, depending on the timelines of the publisher. So onto some of the detailed research and stories that have come out of the project. Before I talk about specific case studies, I'll tell you a little bit about Queensland's arcades. So influenced by British and European precursors, arcades were adopted as a retail and leisure site in colonial Australia from 1853. For the next 70 years or so, these promenades, lined with shops and lit from above by glass, were constructed in most capital cities as well as regional urban centres. And we can see the various places across Australia where they were constructed. And these are just the 19th century ones. I was going to do up to the 20th century, early 20th century, my thesis, but it just was too big a job in the end. So restricted myself to the 19th century. Their form changed somewhat early in the early decades of the 20th century, but they, I think, continue to be an architectural solution in cities and suburbs through to the present day. So the modern Sydney arcade from the early 2000s is one example of that. Arcades were retail and leisure centres where people of all classes gathered, shopped and worked. They were local nodes of global exchange networks, including of commodities, people and ideas, which circulated in their shops, tea rooms, restaurants, photography studios, music halls, bookstores and more. In Queensland, 4 were built during the final 3 decades of the century. These echoed the design of several similar examples built in Melbourne in the 1850s to 1870s and early 1880s Sydney. They were in turn modelled on examples in cities worldwide, and probably the most famous of those in Britain, France and Italy. The 4 in Queensland included 2 built in far north Queensland, in Charters Towers in 1888 and Townsville in 1901. There were also 2 built in Brisbane, by the same owner, and only a few doors apart from each other on Queen Street. I'll put the Brisbane Arcade there because it's fairly well known, so that's where that is. And this is the corner of Edward and Queen where one of the arcades was, and near the GPO where the other was. So they were only a few doors apart, and first came the Royal Exhibition Arcade in 1877, and 8 years later the Grand Arcade on this corner, which you might recognise when I tell you what's on it now. And that's the building I'm actually going to focus on today. I'm just going to take that one spot. I wanted to concentrate on these examples for several reasons. I wanted to highlight Brisbane's rich urban history, which probably arguably doesn't get as much attention as Sydney or Melbourne. Also, most people probably don't know about Brisbane's 19th century arcades, but recognise the Brisbane Arcade kind of almost immediately, which had its 100th anniversary last year. A few publications have talked about them, and this includes Judith Nissen's wonderful Pedestrian Passages and Consumer Dreamworlds, Shopping Arcades of Central Brisbane, which is actually probably one of the few comprehensive studies. I would say it's the only comprehensive study of a city's arcades in Australia. I also thought of the arcade as a contained space where we could observe and compare the life experiences of several businesswomen who had a single location in common. So to tell the story of the Grand Arcade's businesswomen, I'm going to start with a man. But we'll get him out of the way. Born near Krakow in Poland, Henry Morwitch experienced a life of movement and settlement throughout Europe and the British Empire. He was involved in commodities, retail ventures and property speculation his whole life. We first find him in the archives as a silversmith in England, initially in Bristol and then London. He migrated and circulated after this around the Australasian goldfields from the 1850s to 1860s, including in Ballarat, Otago and Gympie, running shops selling necessities to miners and other settlers. Throughout this 20-year period, bankruptcy was a regular experience for him, perhaps because of the cycles of boom and bust in mining towns, or perhaps just for poor financial acumen. The last seems to have been the reason for his departure from New Zealand in 1864 and his reappearance soon after in Brisbane. Despite the bankruptcy, over the next decade, he opened a series of pawnbroker and other general merchandise stores, both in Brisbane and Gympie, and began to prosper, building a valuable property portfolio during the 1870s. His largest, most valuable property was Morwitch's Mineries on the corner of Queen and Edward Street, named for the section of London's Whitechapel where he and his wife had lived in the 1850s. He as a young tradesman and before their marriage, and she was a girl in the house of her merchant father. The complex that Morwitch developed took about 5 years from 1880. Firstly, he constructed a large building on the corner of Edward and Queen Streets, which is kind of this one here. And that was known for many decades as Hunter's Corner after Hunter's Boot Shop. Several individual shops were constructed adjacent to this on both streets. And then in 1885, he opened the L-shaped Grand Arcade, and it ran kind of at an L shape around this corner block. The Grand Arcade and the associated Mineries building had over 60 lettable spaces, with 56 in the arcade itself, so on the ground floor, when it opened. In the 1887 Post Office Directory, the first year the arcade appears, 48 business people are in the ground floor shops and upper storey office spaces. Of these, only 3 specifically mention women as business owners. Downstairs was Miss Rome, a milliner at Shop 51, and hairdresser and tobacconist Mrs. Pollock at 50. Upstairs, Mrs. Blenkinsop-Brem, a servants' registry. These 3 very different businesses were run by women amongst a large number of men owners, with establishments including a tailor, draper, jeweller, engraver, fruiterer, architects, theatrical agents and accountants. This sort of similar mix of businesses seems to have largely continued here through the 19th century and into the 20th. The percentage of women-run businesses appears to have remained relatively small, with between 1 and 7 businesswomen listed each year. They owned some retail shops or tea rooms, but the majority ran businesses of other types. In 1904, for example, of the 4 women listed, 2 were clairvoyants, 1 ran a refreshment room, and the other a servants' registry. In 1919 to 1920, the year with the most women listed, at 7, there were only 1 or possibly 2 retail stores, a milliner and a dressmaker, while others included a music teacher and 2 nurses' bureaus. This is in stark contrast to the Brisbane arcade, further up Queen Street when it opened 4 years later. Of the 52 businesses in that arcade in the 1924 to 25 dictionary, women ran 15 to 20 businesses. I want to say we have to be really cautious with these statistics. So the Post Office directories, which are our major source for this kind of late 19th century time frame, and they give listings, which you can kind of see here, example of. They give a listing of all the city businesses on the street, and they give an idea of the tenants. But these directories and some other kind of official sources like rate books aren't always exact. For example, the Grand Arcade business owners listed in the directory's trade section are not always the same as those listed in the alphabetical section or the street-by-street listings. In other cases, businesses appear in newspaper advertisement but not the directory. Additionally, as we'll see with Sophia, Often women are hidden behind the names of their male relatives to some or great extent. This is further complicated in this case because the year after its first appearance in the directories, the number of businesses in the Grand Arcade seems to halve. And that was purposeful. Henry Morwitch was buying out his tenants so he could lease the whole property to one person. And that's a document about a fire in the arcade where he talks about that, is one you'll see if you come on the tour today. It's with Sophia Morwitch, the wife of Henry, that we see how buried the evidence for women's involvement in business can be. In both 19th and 20th century newspapers, Henry was always described as the owner of the arcades, with the idea that he was the brains and the money behind them. Advertising told about his worth as a good citizen and connected Queensland's progress as a colony with his business ventures, both the construction of buildings on some of the best sites in Brisbane and his involvement in the booming boot and shoe trade. A few give snippets about his wife, and she's described as Mrs. Morwitch, a capable and industrious housewife, paying due regard and deference to her illustrious lord. She was always pleasant and neighbourly. So like so many women in history, her life is described as that of a good and obedient wife in print media. Her involvement in business is only revealed through chance encounters and deep dives into the archives. So who is she? Sophia Lazarus was born in about late 1840 in the city of London, near the Minories in Whitechapel, to a Jewish merchant family. And she died in Brighton, Sussex, UK, on the 20th of February 1933. She first crossed the ocean at 22 years of age to New Zealand in 1863, settling in her uncle's house in Dunedin, where she married Henry in 1864, and they immediately moved to the Otago goldfields. After only a short time, Henry's bankruptcy, his failure to be a publican and merchant there, probably precipitated their move to Brisbane. They remained here for 30 years before leaving for Sydney in 1896. And in 1903, they returned to London, and after the death of Henry 4 years later, Sophia finally moved to Brighton, where she died in 1933. Her story's a bit of a patchwork. It's decipherable largely through online family history records, British censuses, death certificates, and information provided by family historians like Scott. Glimpses of her also appear in the newspapers, but they're usually, apart from those articles I talked about, in classified. So someone to be applied to for a maidservant or when letting a house. But a few little clues surfaced during the research I did on her that made me want to dig a bit deeper. In an 1867 perjury case, for example, Sophia's physical presence in Henry's pawnbrokers is mentioned on a number of occasions, including at one time being inside the counter. When advertising for servants, either for herself or others in the 1880s and 90s, applicants are directed to Sophia either in the Grand Arcade boot shop or its office. It's Sophia who directed King and King in the mid-1980s to sell a large lot of household furniture on the Grand Arcade site in preparation for their move to Sydney. So while my initial focus had been on Henry, as I dug deeper, little hints like these led me to suspect that Sophia played more of a role in the business than some records suggested. One revelation came through this material in the New Zealand National Archives. So newspapers from Otago tell us that Henry became insolvent on the goldfields, where he was a hotel keeper and merchant. And these are the records related to his insolvency. And they preserve his actual verbal testimony about the insolvency. They give an idea about his debtors and the goods he owed them money for, which you can see here. This was actually his uncle, his wife's uncle, one of his debtors. But it also talks a little bit about Sophia's involvement. So he states that he authorised Sophia to keep the expenditure books for him, that she wrote down the records of what she took over the bar, and at times paid wages to staff. So while he was the public face of their businesses and took responsibility for the financial success, clearly Sophia worked with him, including handling the finances, which is actually something that is very common in family businesses, where the women handle the money. She's regularly mentioned in these documents, but he downplays her role. So he emphasises her money and personal belongings are her own. She's got no financial stake in the hotel or the store. He doesn't know how much her jewellery's worth. He's unentitled to any money from her or power of attorney. And she hasn't taken any jewellery or furnishings from the property that's owed to the debtors. So this all suggests that he hoped to prevent her money and property being sold to pay his debtors. But they pretty much set up another business immediately on arriving in Brisbane several months later, which they took off from New Zealand to come to Brisbane without this being resolved. So it seems likely that either probably some financial backing came from her money, or maybe some money was transferred to her, which is something that was a not uncommon strategy. Further evidence comes from far in her future in her probate packet in New South Wales State Archives. When she died in 1933, she was a wealthy woman who left an estate of £90,000, which I looked on the UK National Archives is about £5 million today. So she was very wealthy. And this included a pub in Sydney on the corner of Pitt and King Street. And this was worth about £70,000 in Australia. So some she left to various relatives in the UK, the US and here, some to her housekeeper and maid, and the bulk to the Brighton Jewish Synagogue. The will was contested by her nephew in the Sydney courts between 1934 and 1937, claiming undue influence by her maid, who received £6,000, huge amount of money at the time. One niece testified that she was a bitter, senile woman living in filth, but the lawyer who wrote her will said she was, quote, a sprightly, well-preserved old lady, a most clear-minded, very intelligent woman. So these were also presented as evidence. These are letters written by Sophia from London and Brighton, designed to show her state of mind. They were penned to her Sydney solicitor over a period of about 30 years. And in them, she gives instructions on the management of the Sydney property. And this is both before and after Henry's death. So she is involved at the time before he dies. They give the impression of a woman that knew how to manage her properties from afar and continued to maintain a keen interest in them. So this, along with some of the other evidence, suggests a woman that had a head for business while her husband acted as the public face. One of the Morwitch's first tenants in the Grand Arcade was Miss Gertrude Rome's London millinery establishment. In contrast to her landlady, its proprietor appeared to be an independent entrepreneur. At no time was her business associated with any male relatives, and she was fully acknowledged as the owner and brains behind the business. In the advertisements and articles that ran regularly, mainly in the Queensland Figaro and Punch during 1886 and 1887. One recounts that she sold up-to-date fashions in the colonies, including those popular in London and Paris, while still another claims that indeed some of her stock is sourced directly from London itself and emphasises the stylishness of the available designs. So this is the quote that says she trained in London, and you can see some of the language they use around the luxury and beauty of the products she sells. She also, in one ad, said that she'd received up-to-date fashion from London on the Bulimba, the ship the Bulimba. The social pages in 1886 describe some of the millinery available. Her bona fides were produced in the advertising, including the emphasis on her connections to London. So that includes her obtaining things from London and training in London. Another article tells of her skill, her deft fingers and good taste, and applauds her as a clever, energetic little artiste. These are all common refrains in Australian advertising, which equates commodities available in Australian colonies, towns and cities with those of Britain and Europe. Some may have been imported from there, while others are colonial made, but of course in the latest styles. This emphasis on connections to stylish, refined and cosmopolitan locations and lifestyles demonstrates a claim to sophistication and civilisation in the Australian colonial landscape, a characterisation that we also see repeatedly in discussions of arcades and other public buildings themselves. Despite the promises of this advertising, hard evidence for Gertrude Rome's international trading, networks and training is very thin. I've spent a lot of time on Trove and international British newspapers and archives and really found very little evidence of her initially as well. Because her surname is actually rare in Queensland at the time, there's very few people with that surname, I was able to put together some of her life story through archival records. But it's taken a year of research to put that together, where I'll put her aside for 1 minute and then I'll go, I'm just go and look at Miss Rome again, see if I can find this woman. Census records indicate that she was born in Muggle, near Liverpool, to cotton broker Thomas Rome and Marie Catherine Rome. They're recorded as living there in 1871, but by 1881 they're living in Birmingham, after which Thomas dies. There's then a 3-year period where Gertrude and the family disappear. So she may have trained in London at this time before she sails for Australia. She arrived in Brisbane at around 17 or 18 years of age on the 29th of December 1884 on the Cloncurry from London, together with her widowed mother and two brothers, Edward and Percy. And she opened the Grand Arcade business a year later, and that's their shipping record. So Percy was very young. Gertrude was not 16. She was probably 17 or 18. So the next year she opened the Grand Arcade business, but she was only a tenant for a year. So this might have been when Morwitch started to try and kick his tenants out. So she advertised it as, I'm not sure if that's actually in there. Yeah, she removed 295 Edward Street, which was quite close by. And she said it was because she had a larger premises and it looked very promising for her business. But she basically disappears almost straight away. Her last newspaper advertisement is in June 1887. And after this, I cannot find her in Australia. There is a Miss Rome who, with Miss Cullen, ran the Ladies' Typewriting Association on Eagle Street in 1889. And there's a Gertrude Rome who offered land for sale to the Coorparoo Council in 1890. But I've found no other information about this so far. We do sadly hear of her family members in the newspapers through an inquest and a death certificate. In December 1889, her 14-year-old brother Percy, swimming with his brother at St. Lucia, drowned just 10 days before Christmas. All are to the grief of her family. So all are discussed in the documents about his death, Percy, Edward and their mother. But Gertrude is not mentioned at all. So she's also not found in birth, marriage or death certificates, which kind of led me to suppose, well, she probably went back to Britain. So I went and started searching in British records after that. I also looked in all the other states' records. I didn't just look in Queensland, so couldn't find her there either. So last month, I'd looked through all the ancestry records and there were a couple of women that maybe were her but didn't seem right, birthplaces, etc. But Ancestry released the 1921 census, February, I think, not very long ago, just as I was writing the article that I'm talking about all this in. And in this census, Mrs. Gertrude Knoop and her husband Alfred, who is a cotton manufacturer, appear in this census with her birthplace recorded as Liverpool. This woman was in censuses from 1891, but she was born in London, supposedly. So it's only in the 1921 census she decides to change her birthplace. This led me to the couple's May 1894 marriage announcement, which identified her as the daughter of the late Thomas Rome of Maggle, Lancashire, a match for Gertrude Rome of Brisbane. That was a big sigh of relief, but then I went, oh my God, I have to rewrite like a whole paragraph of my article now. Despite having tracked her life, though, we're left with totally lots of questions about Gertrude as a businesswoman, which is actually what I'm really, really interested in. These are commonly missing pieces when attempting to trace in entrepreneurial women, though. They talk about their husbands and their wives and their children. Sorry, their husbands and their children, but they don't often talk about their work. They often also call themselves, say they have home duties on the electoral rolls, on other documents when they actually did have their own business or helped in the family business. There's that. So as I said, there's little evidence for her trade networks. We don't know who financed and ran the business. Did her mother have money? Was it inherited from her father? Did her mother run the business, but Gertrude seemed like a better kind of prospect to be the front woman of the business? These are all some unanswered questions, and if there's anyone out here who's ever heard of this woman and knows anything, I'd be lovely to hear. So on to my last example. While Sophia and Gertrude occupied the Grand Arcade in the mid-1880s, Madame Degrevel, palmist and clairvoyant, operated in the Edward Street wing. Another migrant to Queensland, unlike Sophia and Miss Rome, Madame Degrevel remained there for the rest of her life, with circumstances motivating her entrepreneurship into very different occupations. She was born Anna Helmenia Mikkelsen on the 4th of April 1863 on the northern Norwegian island of Hinøya. The 22-year-old migrated in 1885 during a period of mass migration from Scandinavia. But unlike many, her destination wasn't the United States. It was Queensland. Before this, she spent 10 days in London, where she married fellow Norwegian Henrik Marcelius Mikkelsen. What drew them here is unclear, but as Fredrik Larsen Lund has explored, Queensland was an attractive prospect for migrants, including Scandinavian migrants, with promises of high wages and land. They lived first at North Pine District, where son Harry was born in January 1887. The next year they moved to north to the Glasshouse Mountains, where Crown land was an offer to settlers. A period of intensifying occupation in that area due to the railway line being opened, and that greatly impacted the local people who were the traditional custodians, the Gubi Gubi and Jinnabara. Henrik selected farmland at the foot of Mount Kunwarren. They cleared bushland, fenced the property, built a house and planted a fruit orchard, which they worked for 2 decades, having 6 more children. The youngest, Norman, was born in 1898. Just over a decade later, Henrik left, returning to Oslo, where he started a new family. Anna's letters, written in the 1920s, suggest that her husband leaving had significant financial impact. Although she ran the property for a few more years, in 1911 she sold up and she was living in Brisbane in Peachtree Terrace by 1913. In January 1914, newspaper classifieds show she had turned to another profession to earn an income, one not uncommon for women in her situation. Anna Mikkelsen became Madame Degrevel, advertising in Brisbane newspapers as a trance medium, clairvoyant and palmist. As Alana Piper has explored, the early years of the 20th century were an increasing period of interest in spiritualism and related practices. Fetes, garden parties, balls and shows often featured fortune tellers as a fun diversion. But it was also an occupation regularly advertised in newspapers, often run by women, and it became increasingly professionalised in this period. And Alana has a fantastic article on this idea. Many of these women, usually women, rented offices in commercial buildings, including Madame Degrevel's upstairs in the Grand Arcade. Most late 19th century arcades were designed not just as retail ventures, which is how we kind of imagine them today, but they also supplied commercial spaces to a wide variety of businesses. They weren't unusual locations for those providing clairvoyant services, and advertisements show these type of businesses operating in similar sites across Australia. So in the Block Arcade, the Eastern Arcade, Adelaide Arcade, etc. Mikkelsen wasn't the only clairvoyant in the Grand Arcade. Over the years, others like Sister Alreen, Madame Mora and Madame St. Aubin operated out of there as well. Madame Degrevel, though, appeared regularly in the New Brisbane newspapers, sometimes daily, from 1914 to mid-1916. Labelled by others as fortune tellers, like most fellow practitioners, she rejected this term and styled herself as a trance medium, palmist and clairvoyant, among other terms. She worked long hours. One ad showed her availability from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m, except on Tuesdays and Fridays when she worked from 10 to 6. Fortune tellers with regular clientele, though, could earn a steady income, and the work was quite lucrative for some. Although an era of professionalisation for these businesses, it also saw increasing policing, legislation and prosecution. Backlash against them arose for a variety of reasons, including fears of their influence over middle-class and elite women, as well as disgruntlement that working-class women could make good money from it. During World War I, a period at which we see a peak in the profession, public concern and criticism often arose about fortune tellers taking advantage of those who feared for their loved ones. The papers that accepted their fees for their short classifieds were also keen to sensationalise and demonise these people. In 1904, Madame Spontini and Madame Mora of the Grand Arcade featured an article called Fortune Telling Frauds, which described their rooms and practices in lurid language. In-depth investigations were also taken by the Brisbane Police during the 1910s to 1920s, which led to the prosecution of Madame Mora and Madame St. Aubin. And this is one of the investigations here. You'll see this today if you come on the tour, and Madame Degrevel, at this time she was in a different place. She was in Chancery Chambers, but that's her, and she appears along some of the others who I've talked about. Somehow she appears in 2 of these reports, and there's big stacks of them here. If you ever want to delve into them, they're really, really fascinating. But she avoided prosecution or any lengthy kind of investigation. After 35 years living in Australia, she applied for naturalisation and a pension in 1921 to 2, with a testimonial attesting her, quote, excellent character with nothing recorded that precludes her from the privileges of naturalisation. So apparently they made no connection between her and Madame Degrevel, but even though her full legal name actually appears in a 1923 police report, just the connections weren't made. After mid-1916, her advertisements declined quite sharply, but she began to regularly feature in spiritualism events at the Brisbane Spiritual Church, where she presented addresses such as spiritualism, pointing out the better way, and conducting psychic readings until late 1923. How, when and why she was drawn into this type of business is not clear, but there's a set of occurrences with her that are similar to the lives of other women who took up this profession. Like Anna, they were often working class and experienced straitened circumstances as a result of their husband's death or their abandonment, or because of age or ill health. Anna was also an older woman when she became a clairvoyant. She was 51 when she started advertising, and she'd been a farmer for most of her adult life, even as a child. She was probably working at the family farm in Norway. So she probably had little skill set that would allow her to take on other employment. These practices may not simply have been a business. In November 1916, the time when her involvement with the spiritual church increased, her 18-year-old son, Norman, enlisted and was shipped out to England. He was killed 2 years later near the Somme in August 1918. While we don't know Anna's thoughts about her business or her spirituality, like her clients, maybe she found comfort in the movement and spiritual life, the opportunity to connect with deceased loved ones and the promise of an afterlife. We do know some of her thoughts about life through her letters attached to Norman's AIF records and her naturalisation application. Her independence is insisted on in these letters, and dealings with the authorities demonstrate a determination to support herself and her children, but also that she would not be dealt with on terms related to her husband. In one, she made clear that she was the family's provider, particularly when the military tried to preference her husband as the recipient of Norman's war medals, and he'd been back in Oslo for, a decade by then. This is one of the letters here. She wrote, "I don't know whether Henrik is living or dead. He's not been heard of since 1909. I have had no communication, nor do I know where he is, only he left Australia in that year for foreign lands." And you can hear her voice going, "Europe most likely." That's what he must have said to her. "And has never been heard of since. He is no more to us. He left the children and myself without support. I, in inverted commas, gave my son for the country. That is all I can say." When government officials tried to deny her naturalisation on the grounds of being a married woman, Anne again wrote in the strongest terms about her abandonment, and an official penciled-in remark, "treat as widow." Her citizenship was issued on 29th of December 1921. On the 25th of August, 1923, Anna and her family placed a memorial for Norman in the Daily Standard. 6 days later, Madame Degrevel last appeared in an advertisement in the same paper for a talk at the spiritual church, the Robes of Immortality. She died a month later on 20th September 1923 of a cerebral hemorrhage. Unusually, her sealed intestacy file, which I've not been allowed to access, as well as associated public curator newspaper notices, are labelled with both her legal name, Anna Helmenia Mikkelsen, and her professional one, Madame Degrevel. Likewise, soon after death, she was memorialised by her family in newspapers, as well as on her tombstone by both names, suggesting that for them and her, these two lives were inextricably connected. And I have actually talked to one of her ancestors, but she has no clue about anything apart from what is public record either. So unfortunately, she has no idea about the motivations or why this all came about. So utilising the Grand Arcade as a locus has allowed me to conduct comparative research on women entrepreneurs from various backgrounds and trajectories who might not otherwise be able to be so closely compared. These three lives discussed today show women whose different life circumstances brought them to own businesses located within one site in Brisbane. They demonstrate both the difficulties and rewards of examining such stories in detail, giving us a rich understanding of some aspects of their businesses, sometimes how they operated, but mainly the life paths and decisions that brought them there, although they might leave many questions unanswered. Each of these women have migrant stories, but different pathways that together produce a story of international lives as they intersected in a specific place and space in Brisbane in the 1880s to 1920s, and reveal stories of global movements and events within a local context. So this pilot study promises a rich body of future work on Brisbane that I hope other people will also be able to be influenced by or inspired by, not only in the arcades but in businesses owned by other women throughout the city. Through the database and the website, the Resource Centre Dictionary, and mapping the movements of these women, I hope to reveal more about the lives of women, not only in this small slice of Brisbane, but in Australia and globally. Thank you.